Well, and this is where it becomes so fascinating for me because it was 12 years. Man, I was consuming real estate data. I was consuming property information. Like my old man still reminds me to this day. Every week, I think it was the Fin Review or something had like a real estate section in the newspaper, and I'll always make him to buy it and give me the real estate section. But for some reason, I just didn't do anything until my now wife is just like, "Hey, mofo, like, what are you doing?" And I'm like,
Hazel, so much respect right now.
And it was triggered by me asking her a question of like, hey, should we invest in another business? And like transparently, we had like 6 figures in a bank account. And I said, there's this business opportunity. Let's go buy some equity and give them a short-term loan and we'll do that thing, which prompted her to ask the question of like, hey, like, is this like what our family should be doing right now? To which I said, it's a very thought-provoking question that I have never thought about and shall start thinking about. Which then led me to like what are going to be the greatest asset types? One which I knew already was property. Looked at some others, and that was the thing that then led me into going, great, what is going to be the best opportunity?
Well, all right, pause right there. You mentioned the idea of having 6 figures in a bank account, which is like capital requirements.
Totally.
Do you think that is required to play the game of property?
I 100% do, because property is a large asset. And in order for you to purchase a large asset, even with debt, you should have an amount in a bank account. Would
you be willing to go on the record and saying if you don't have more than 100 grand in a bank account, you shouldn't play property?
It's actually funny because that was going to be my question that I was going to ask to you later. Because I was going to ask you the question of like, what is the threshold? It's like, what is the minimum? And so we had, I think it was like 120, 140 or something like that in a bank account. And then I still remember, so I'm like, cool, I'm going to go do this thing. I spoke to a whole heap of people around like, well, what buyer's agents do they use? We even spoke about like potentially buying it ourselves and we'll just go find something to buy. Thank gosh, we never did that. And that's when we spoke to yourself and some others and just met up with like Goose and Gabby from Dashdot and did, it's kind of the trigger to the rest of the conversation. And during that course of that journey, we were constantly talking about like, what are the things that we need to have as a family to make us happy? And one of the big parts that we had was we need to put 20% deposit down because we've got business.
Yeah, clarify happiness there. It's the idea of what do we need to be comfortable to be investing in property, right? What are the requirements there? And happiness, we cover differently because we both know if it was about happiness, it will be about buying more Apple products.
You know me too well. Oh, shit. Yes. And so it was like, cool, well, we're going to need an emergency fund for sleep at night factor, I'll call it. So it was great. Sleep, emergency fund, what do we need to have? At least a year worth of living, happy days. Good. So check. We could do that and cut it.
Okay. We got 2 here. So Grant's checklist. So 2 years of living expenses set aside as an emergency fund.
Yeah. At that point it was 1, but yeah, now it's
okay.
Longer.
And then at least 100 grand ready to go for a deposit for a property. Or would you be happy to say a 20% deposit? It might be less than 100 grand if that's
totally,
appropriate.
20. And that was exactly where it was a 20% deposit. And so then we looked at it and we said, and by the way, the third checklist is have like some why, like some kind of like epiphany moment to get in.
Get your wife to crush you. Gotcha.
Literally, totally. And so then we got to this point of we said, well, we can't do it ourselves. We just don't know enough about everything. We consumed podcasts, everything, did the usual stuff that people do. Let's go and talk to a buyer's agent, which we did. And then kind of the rest is history. One of the caveats that I will say to that is we spoke to the buyer's agent and said explicitly, hey, we've never done this before. We kind of want to dip our toe in the water. What is the smallest amount that we could potentially spend on a property that would be the representation of us dipping the toe in the water to see if it's right for us, to see if it's not right for us, and sort of see where it lands? Is we actually managed expectations to go, well, how do we just not risk a huge amount? And so the place that we bought was like, I don't know, $250,000, $300,000, and which meant the amount that we needed to put in, buyer's agent fees, stamp duty, and closing was less than $100,000.
See, I don't mind that though, because you might get into property and go, do you know what, this isn't for me. I could understand why that is for some people. It definitely isn't for everyone. It's like skiing, right? It's not for everyone. You might go to the snow and go, do you know what? I don't like the cold, which is me, by the way. I'm not doing that shit.
I wanted it to be at a point where, and it was funny, when we walked in there, we had like an okay belief system. I would say it wasn't a great belief system of just going like, what happens if this thing went like tits up? I was like, what happens if this thing was vacant for 6 months? And we just go, well, how do we just not risk a huge amount? And so the place that we bought was like, I don't know, $250,000, $300,000, which meant the amount that we needed to put in, buyer's agent fees, stamp duty, and closing was less than $100,000. See, I don't mind that though, because What would we do? How would we approach it?
Wait. How funny that the vacancy. 'Cause I had the vacancy thing as well. And it's like vacancies have just gone through the floor since then, which I mean isn't going to be the case. There are times in history where vacancies have gone higher, obviously, but it's just the irony of that being a fear and what has eventuated has been very funny.
Well, but that was the thing. And so like it all came from like, just look at where we started. Emergency
Can I put one more in?
Emergency fund and vacancy rate. Yeah, go on.
Did you have like FOMO on the idea of like, why didn't I buy 10 years ago?
Yes. It got to a point where I'd like find statistics. And I'm like, let's not send that to Hazel. Because I'm like, she'd be like, why were you playing business 10 years ago? Just not deal with this stuff. And I'm like, oh.
But what's really common here, and I find very interesting that you had the same thing, or not, although not really, we tend to twinning quite a lot here.
Yeah,
but the point I'll make is like when I first got into property, it's amazing how poor my mindset was in the negativity. When you haven't done it before, just how susceptible you are to the ideas of like, well, do you know what? I'm only going to buy a property for 250 grand because if it does go bad, at least I'll be able to pay that debt off. I wouldn't want millions in debt.
All right, fellow property investor. If you loved the value from this short video and wanted to know more about how you can win at property investing, check out the full episode by clicking the link on your screen or in the description right now. Alternatively, click subscribe and you'll never miss another one of these videos.